for coming out tonight, everybody. Appreciate your attendance here. And I know everybody wants to be in the field, so we won't spend too long, although for those of you who are going to the Long Dog group, we can talk about this a little bit more. So Helen and Allan Cruickshank. So who were they? They were really the pioneers in Brevard as far as conservation goes. And that was the term that when they were here, that was more prominent than environmentalism, which ended up, I think they were also very important in developing the environmental ethic here and the whole environmental movement. Allan was a photographer for the National Audubon Society, so he worked out of New York. He was a graduate of New York NYU, and he was an athlete. He threw the javelin, he was on the track team. But even before that, he was part of a group called the Bronx Boys, the Bronx Boys Bird Club. And they had these wonderful members. Probably most notably was Roger Torrey Peterson, ended up becoming one of the members. Kind of later, he came from Western New York and over to go to art school in New York City. But they birded, Allan got pretty famous for finding birds that were not seen in New York City area before, and he came under, pardon the wing, the wing of some of the people at the National History Museum in New York City, and so they encouraged these guys to enhance their birding. They started doing their Christmas bird counts in New York City, and they were finding species that these experts or professional ornithologists could not ever find. So he after he graduated from NYU, he took a job on Wall Street that lasted probably a day. He said, "This is not right for me. This is crazy." And he ended up going back to the museum and eventually to the Audubon Society, where he served as one of the key teachers at Hog Island. Has anybody been to Hog Island here? Okay, so if you want a life-changing experience, it's a little pricey, but I would go there. It's a wonderful location. The instructors are great and knowledgeable. You'll see birds I bet a lot of you have never seen before, and you eat really well too. So and they just came out with their schedule. So you might want to take a look at that. It's in Maine for anybody who doesn't know. It's in Maine, yeah. It's way up in Maine. It's not easy to get to. So Allan worked there. He worked there. Actually, Roger Torrey Peterson worked there for a year with him. And so he became famous, but even prior to that, forgot to mention that he met Helen. And he met Helen when he was on a field trip, and he saw this woman in an apple tree. I mean, literally in the tree. Now, if you ever look at him, Helen was a lot shorter, so she needed any advantage she could take. And so they met, and they fell in love pretty quickly. Got married in New York City, and the first thing they did a honeymoon trip. And the honeymoon trip was here, in Florida. So they traveled. There's this wonderful log that's at the University of Florida that details their trip and adventures down here. So as they came down, people come down to Florida in February. They start taking their coats off. It's getting warmer, and they're seeing more birds. And the first observation, though, that Allan made when he got to Florida was he saw this chain gang. These people in these striped shirts and ball and chain and working on the road. He's like, I've never seen anything like this before except for a bad movie. So that was welcome to Florida. Some things have never changed. And so they came down here. They did this extensive trip. They spent most of the time in Kissimmee Prairie area now, but they traveled the whole state. They went down to the Keys. They went down to the Everglades. And they came back and they stopped and they spent some time in Titusville and Cocoa on the lagoon. And they came back here several times on trips. And finally, they decided, we want to move here. And so they bought a home. They had a home built, actually, here in Rockledge on Open Drive, where they lived, I think it was 1952, and they lived the rest of their lives there. So, so they got very interested in preserving the space. This is such a wonderful area. They didn't realize there was a local Audubon group here. So they went out for, I think, one of the Christmas counts in the mid to early 50s, and they ran out with these other people who were also birding, doing a Christmas bird count. So they got together, they got Allan involved with that. And really the rest is history, because Allan saw how wonderful this area was for bird counts, and he started recruiting people to help him with his bird counts, including Roger Torrey Peterson and professors from the University of Florida and Tennessee, and they just killed it. I mean, this area led the Christmas bird count for about 11 years straight. And part of it, is in fact to do that, we had such different habitats and areas for the birds to flock to. So they did really two. They did the Cocoa count, and they did a count which at the time was the Titusville count, but it included Merritt Island. Of course, at that time, Merritt Island wasn't under the NASA preview. So during this time in the 50s, he tried to convince the government to buy this land in Merritt Island to be as a preserve. And the government said, yeah, we don't have the money. And you got to remember too, up until Cape Cod was bought, there was never any federal money used to purchase conservation lands. It was just something they didn't do. The government never spent money on that. So that's a breakthrough that they had. And Allan kept, encouraging and working behind the scenes, and then NASA came in and they started buying all this land. And there were a lot of very upset people, if you know the history here locally. People that I got to talk to during some interviews, they said when there was a launch, they turned their back, the people who got dislocated. And one of the people, the more famous people, that at least to us, that got dislocated was Laura Lee Thompson. So her family had a home on the beach, and she told me this great story. Then they go there to go visit her grandmother, and they get out of the car. There was like this routine. The car would stop in front of the home, then play Linda Beach, and they'd go, everybody leave, and they would run as fast as they can, and they went into their aunt's house where they would get beaten with newspapers to get all the mosquitoes off. So she had good memories, but unfortunately, her home was one of the many that were taken over by the government for NASA, which is not a bad thing. But so at the same time, Allan started working behind the scenes to get this land preserved. He was working with NASA, and NASA knew they had a PR issue, so they decided we're going to make a buffer. And so slowly the Merritt Island Wildlife Refuge was formed, and it was formed in these different aliquots of 25,000 acres originally, which is the side where Black Point is, and eventually expanded several times through different administrations, where now it's 140,000 plus acres. So we owe a lot to Allan, and as Allan was here, it's funny because I don't think he ever served on the board at Audubon here. I don't believe so. But he was always involved, and he was always a leader. And one of his famous recordings is his last Christmas bird count. So he was compiler for the Christmas bird count for the whole country, not just for Brevard County. And he was thorough. Like, if you saw a bird there that was unlikely, he challenged you, as he should be. He really made sure that you had, picture photography or some other characteristics of that bird to demonstrate that you really saw it. So during his last talk, he and of course they did this at the Rockledge Presbyterian Church, which we still meet at. He said, as he's getting ready to get the count going, because there's always everybody would do their count, and then they would shout out, if you saw this bird, they go through the list. He said, I'm probably the only person in the world who ever gave up a kidney operation to do a Christmas bird count. So, and he died, I think, the next year up in Gainesville, up in the hospital, at the University of Florida area. But they left a legacy. So if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't have Merritt Island Wildlife Refuge, or it's very unlikely we would have. And we wouldn't have areas like this. So they set that conservation ethic, that environmental, modern environmental movement here in Brevard County. So we have a lot to be grateful to them for. So I just want to mention a couple things. If you're really interested in knowing more about the history of the Merritt Island Wildlife Refuge, the Florida Historical Society published an article I wrote about the Merritt Island Wildlife Association, or Refuge. And there's a couple of these left at the Historical Society. I think they're $10, so you can buy them. It goes to a good cause. If you're interested in becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society, you can get these online and go back to their back issues. And I think it's a $50. Another plug I want to make here real quick is there's a new book out by Clay Henderson. If anybody here know Clay Henderson, he still is a attorney, but he was a president of Florida Audubon. So he writes a story here about the history of conservation in Florida, which includes of course, Merritt Island Wildlife Refuge. So this just came out, University of Florida Press. Great Christmas present, highly recommend it. I think Clay's going to be here in January to speak at the zoo. So, and I don't have a date, but once I do, I'll certainly share that. He was going to come here earlier, but we had a thing called the hurricane. And so we didn't get a chance. It's called Forces of Nature. Clay Henderson. And lastly, and I'll share, I'll pass this around later when we get back to the restaurant, is I was, I don't say willed, but I was given a book with the Cruickshanks, the history of the Cruickshanks. So a very early picture back in the 40s, and then all sorts of pictures with Allan teaching, training, out on field trips, lecturing, newspaper articles, the dedication of the Cruickshank Trail out at the Wildlife Refuge, and just a lot of good kind of cool things. And so I'll pass this around when we get to the restaurant. And maybe give this to you guys from the library eventually.
We would love it.